Good evening, I'm John. I'm the event director at Literati Bookstore. We're so pleased to welcome Jin and to our At Home with Literati series in support of his song Everlasting and in conversation this evening with author Lillian Li. Just a quick webinar overview for those of you who are just joining us. The chat is closed, but you can keep the chat window open as I will be dropping links to purchase a song Everlasting from Literati throughout the event. Of course, if you're watching us later on our YouTube channel, you can always find links to purchase books in the description directly below me. If you're watching us live, you can use the Q&A feature on your toolbar to submit questions at any time, and I will read a selection on your behalf at the conclusion of the conversation. And finally, live transcription is available on your toolbar as well if you need it. And as a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And if you live in Southeast Michigan or in the Ann Arbor area, our doors are open to the public for in-store shopping. Most of all, we'd like to thank you for your attendance this evening or this morning or this afternoon, depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce tonight's author and our moderator. Jin left his native China in 1985 to attend Brandeis University. He's the author of 8 novels, 4 story collections, 4 volumes of poetry, a biography of Li Bai, and a book of essays. He has received the National Book Award, 2 PEN Faulkner Awards, the PEN Hemingway Award, and the Flannery O'Connor Award for short fiction. In 2014, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Letters. He's a professor in the creative writing program at Boston University. And Lillian Li received her BA from Princeton and her MFA from the University of Michigan. She's a recipient of a Hopwood Award in short fiction, as well as Glimmer Train's New Writer Award. Her work has been featured in Guernica, Granta, and Jezebel. She is from the DC metro area and lives in Ann Arbor, and her first novel is #1 Chinese Restaurant. Please join me in welcoming Jin and Lillian Li to your living rooms.
Right. So I was already telling Han the kind of private reception area that we have on Zoom that I just tore through his book in 2 days. I could not put it down. It is such a sweeping epic that is at the same time also very grounded in the sort of domestic and everyday, and just a larger exploration of what it means to be an artist and what it means to be free. But that's my take on your book. So I kind of want to kick things off, if you wouldn't mind, maybe talking about what this book is about in your words. How would you maybe sell your book if you were at a Literati bookstore and you found a customer who was interested?
Oh, thank you so much. Really, I'm very pleased by your response, especially from a young author's response. And because in a way, I'm old-fashioned. So, so that's why I'm not certain about how people would take this book. But for me, in fact, fundamentally is basically, I want to write a good book, very basic. Try to make a piece of art of the book. But of course, the story, I happen to know about several artists, including singers, musicians, who immigrated to the States. Some of them eventually couldn't make it, couldn't take it, and returned to China. And they used to be mega stars in China, but they left behind everything. But some of them, they're still working. They live in this country for decades and became immigrants, but some just returned. So I want to really write about, combine some of them into one person, about the artist, how an artist to live and survive as an immigrant. In fact, the protagonist here is, originally he was kind of exile, self-imposed exile, but there's a process, gradually he began the immigrant experience process. So that was in a way, it's also conventional. We know, especially among the European immigrants earlier on, usually it's one family member who came first and spent years earning the passage for the whole family. So it did have that pattern. But in our time, in his case, it was planned that way. but didn't work because there are so many powers beyond their own control. So it didn't end or happen that way. So in a way, it's American story. At the same time, it has a peculiar foreignness in the story.
Yeah, I was really interested in how Tian, your protagonist, who is this celebrity singer in China, doesn't quite occupy either the immigrant or the exile or political dissenter space. That while a lot of, I think, books, both fiction and nonfiction, that feature Chinese nationals tend to have them either as people who immigrate, and so there's a lot of tropes that come with immigrants and that immigrant experience, or they're political defectors who have their own kind of story and their own political agenda. Tian, in some ways, is neither. You know, his immigration is as a celebrity, and so he doesn't come with a lot of the initial baggage of somebody who's starting over a completely new life. He's maybe only starting over in the sense of having to build his own celebrity within America, but he does have more of the cushioning than most American immigrants do. And then on the political side, he isn't initially very political. He is mostly leaving China in order to preserve his artistic freedom, which is maybe more individual than political at first. And so I wondered about why you chose to feature a character who doesn't fit neatly into those two identities that we see most often.
By nature, he doesn't like politics. He even bragged that he was apolitical.
Yeah.
But the truth is, in real life, in reality, you have to take side. There is no choice. Sometimes you have to. In his case, one way or another, he got entangled. His sister was in jail in China, and also basically killed. And so there's no way for him to remain a neutral person. Also, he initially didn't plan to live in the States for too long, but once he tasted the kind of solitary life, free life, he began to appreciate that. So he got in a way addicted, and also there are many other forces. I think especially among a lot of exiled immigrants, at some point you can't return. You reach the point where there is no return. I think he reached that point. Gradually, it became clear, and there was no way for him to go back to China. He has to continue to become an immigrant. So that was a peculiar story. But I think I've never read a story like that. That's why I wanted to write about this kind of peculiar case.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that makes a lot of sense that if you aren't seeing that kind of story, that as a writer, there is a desire to fill that space and to explore and pioneer that imaginative landscape, which I think you do so well. And one thing that really grabbed me from the very beginning is when Tian is leaving China, it's in part because his passport is about to be confiscated. He sees a life of complete creative suffocation and having to essentially be part of the political and propaganda machine of his government. But when he comes to America, he realizes that, you know, the reach of his government is a lot deeper and more pervasive than he could have ever guessed. And there's just this sense of suspicion that is all throughout, especially the first half of the novel. It poisons almost every character we meet, because I'm always wondering, is this a spy? Is this a saboteur? How is this person going to mess up this, you know, protagonist's life? And I would almost say that you've written not a suspense novel, but a suspicion novel, which I've also never really seen before. And I would just love to hear more about how you chose to write about suspicion and why that is so present, especially in the first part of your novel.
In fact, if you live in the Chinese community, especially among the exiles, that happened all the time. So when I finished the novel, people, the response would say, this is too political, it's too much. But look at what happened. A lot of things turn out to be the same, exactly the same. the Chinese government now stopped issuing passports, and a lot of passports were taken back. And we also discovered there are a lot of people who work for the Chinese government outside China. And so for a lot of people, especially in his case, as a kind of a celebrated artist back in China. Mm-hmm. So he is surrounded by people he suspected. That was almost natural. But when I started the book, I couldn't think too much about it. But I have to follow my own instinct, my own sense for reality. For me, at the time, this was the reality. I think still in that sense, the book is still truthful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Given those instincts, would you say that, you've authored over 20 books of not just fiction, but also poetry and nonfiction? Does this feel like one of your most personal books that you've written so far?
No, really, because I don't know much about music, and this is not about my personal experience. But I did live in a town like Quincy for some years, so I was familiar with Flushing. I had a volume of stories, a good fall set in that city, so I was familiar with a lot of things. But this is not my story. But at the heart, I do share his pen. That's another dimension. We talk about immigrant, but here we have an artist, how to survive as an artist, especially once he wandered beyond his comfort zone, his familiar territory, enter alien space. And so he has to deal with it. In a way, that's all our concern. You have to deal with a diminished thing, especially as an immigrant. Those who are really stars back home, but now here is nobody. You have to start from scratch. So that's normal. That's common. But the problem is with a lot of accomplished celebrities in their own lands, they didn't expect this. They didn't expect that the loneliness, the big struggle, all the frustrations. But in his case, gradually he tried to manage to deal with everything. So we can see in the end he succeeds in his own way, on his own terms. So I don't think this is a complete story about failure. In a way, he succeeds in different way. That also, I think, is true. We don't know what we could do before the immigration process. Afterward, in the process, you can discover that you can become a different person. You may be good at different things. So for him, eventually he became a songwriter.
Right. Yeah. The expansion of, and also the almost chameleon quality that you have to have as an immigrant in order to find success or even just stability in a new country, really came through, especially with your character, Yabin, who is, I think, one of my favorite characters. He is fantastic. And, he, for those who haven't read the book, he is the friend of Tian's who kind of inadvertently gets him in trouble with the Chinese government. But from that point on, becomes a kind of ally. And at the same time, maybe a foil, just a counterpart, because he is so slippery. And whereas Tian is rather steadfast, and he has so many different lives. He's always landing on his feet. He's almost amoral. He's always just looking out for number one. And I just think that was such an embodiment of, what it takes sometimes to be a successful immigrant. To really remake yourself is in some ways to have loyalty to nothing, including your own self. And
you're right. I'm glad you like it. Really, there's no real person as a model. I combined different people into it, that character. You're right. The sense, how to survive. Many immigrants, you have to be very slippery in a way to follow your instinct in order to survive. To basically, he is the one who can always make the best of this of different situations, and always benefit from from others even.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. He will never say no to a handout.
That's true.
Yeah, and I think that the other side of maybe surviving as an immigrant was I noticed that there's already a fairly large cast of characters, but it feels even larger because we're constantly getting, stories of like friends of friends or extended family members. There's this network of, loose connections within the immigrant community, and that's how a lot of information gets passed along. If you're trying to get your visa, somebody's uncle's friend has also gone through it. If you're sick and you need to get health insurance, oh, this old classmate's husband had to do the exact same thing. And it's a really interesting, informal way that almost reminded me of the internet and how information is passed along and how survival sometimes depends on all the connections you make, no matter how loosely connected you are to people. And I wondered if, you were purposefully trying to bring in this idea that you can't really be alone as an immigrant, that you kind of depend on a network of people at all times.
Yes, in a way that is still kind of residue of the old land, the old customs, old culture. And in his case, because the sense of network is strong. And also because he's a celebrity, he used to be a celebrity. So somehow people can recognize him. So some are willing to give him a hand. So it is also a matter of survival. But on the other hand, he really loved solitude. He realized to be free also is to be left alone. So he doesn't like crowds, but he had a sense of community, really. But he couldn't explain this to his wife. For instance, he shared an apartment with a roommate who happened to be a woman.
Right.
And the wife couldn't understand that. But the truth is, for immigrants, you have to, like some animals, you have to keep together, to keep warm, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
That's the very basic instinct of survival. It's a tradition. And so that is essential. That's why I think whenever a community invites him to sing or to perform, he would always oblige. There's that sense. I think that is a positive aspect.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I've always been interested in just even thinking about my family, the friends that they've made in America that they would maybe have never socialized with if they had stayed back in China, that it's really only within this specific environment that these kinds of friendships can even exist.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's the same here. Yes. And somehow you trust people who happen to be in a similar situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think if the first half of the novel is all about suspicion, that second half is interested in how trust is built by the maybe normal everyday experience of living side by side with someone that you might not have nothing in common with otherwise.
Yes.
And I think that, something else that I found really interesting about what you said of the freedom and the solitude of not always being looked at was, it reminded me of a story that my mom was telling me recently. She was just mentioning that she had met some people who used to be heart surgeons back in Beijing, and then now they were postal workers in America. And I was interested by, why they chose to come over when they had success in China. And she was saying, they just enjoyed being able to wear their slippers whenever they wanted. Yes. This idea of you don't always have to be completely dressed and, fit for public consumption. That if you wanted to just wear your slippers around the house and around your yard, nobody would say anything. And that is a freedom I had never thought of.
Yes, because that's, your mother is absolutely right. You have your own space. With your own space, you can do whatever you want. People leave you alone. But in China, you can't. Even you buy an apartment, you only have the user's right for certain years. At some point, the government, the state can take it back. So it's different. Really, it's well controlled in every aspect. Nowadays, basically, because of the electronic, the technology, and everything, personal information, everything is available to the powers that be. So it's different. And of course, a lot of people, they have they are significant. They do significant work back in their old land, but the problem is they can't live their own life. That's a big difference. You can't live your own life. For instance, toward the end, there was an old retired government official who said he enjoyed being here. Nobody.
Right.
He has to lie, even he has to dye his hair, everything, because you have to be able to conceal things. Everybody around you are doing that. If you don't follow others, then you stand out. You'll be in trouble.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the concealment is also so interesting because it has made everyone, at least the characters in your book, and also I recognize this in real life, the ability to really read between the lines and understand all the unspoken codes of conduct. You know, an example that I saw just in the beginning is that when Tian is asking for permission from the director of his choir to stay an extra day or so in New York, he says, well, now I'm going to have to buy him a generous gift. It's never spoken. It's just understood. And they both understand it. And I was fascinated by that. Just the ways in which, even with that concealment, there becomes almost an extra ability to see what is under the surface and to know what is expected without having to be necessarily told. And I was interested in what your experience was as a writer of telling those unspoken things, which I think maybe other people might find just take it for granted, not necessarily knowing all the chess moves you have to make to get through a social events in China.
But I think yes, and we have to think about describe the character's mind. In the craft we call it interiority, right? How the mind works, how the person can perceive others' expectations, and also the sense of the world around him or her. So that is important because for me, I think a character's mind is more interesting. Not just physical action, it's really the mind. And so that in that sense, he is perceptive, I think. He understands the codes and the expectations of others. But on the other hand, he's also somehow, he was not as smart.
Right.
He was not as smart. It's different from Yabing. Yabing is really at every turn, he knows what is best for him. So absolutely. You use the word foil. In a way, I didn't expect that, but I just intuitively, I realized, I felt that should be a character like that, opposite to
Absolutely. It definitely feels that Yabin is like just a better chess player. I can imagine if they played chess that he would beat Tian every single time. And, getting back to how part of it is, simply as writers, we are capturing the interiority of a character. And I think oftentimes what it feels like is that interiority is the psychology of a character. So something that feels true in the interiority is something that feels psychologically true. But it seemed that what you were getting at was even larger. It felt more like a social psychology, that it wasn't just the way that a person is thinking about themselves, but also how he sees himself as just a cog in a larger machine, as part of a social dance. And so that felt very interesting to see.
Yes, I think they will have to have a balance, a sense of proportion. If a story, a piece of fiction becomes too interior, and then the story might suffer.
Yeah.
Also, that means very often it becomes a kind of expression of a sentiment, thoughts after thoughts, shades of feelings. But where's the story? And for me, I think story is also very important. It basically is the foundation of a piece of fiction. It has to have a story in it.
Absolutely. There is a lot of great story throughout A Song Everlasting. And I was really captivated by that sweeping quality because you have a character who's traveling to multiple continents, multiple states. There's also these grand performances. There's historical events like the Tiananmen Square massacre that are evoked and thought about. And there's also just cycles of, sickness and recovery that just feel really grand and like a lot of time is passing. But you also have this ability to stay incredibly grounded in the domestic and the everyday. I think a lot of your scenes actually happen at a kitchen table or at a restaurant. And there's an interest in his daily exercises as a singer. And the example I'll give is the process of Tian realizing that his passport is about to get confiscated and then managing to get a visa and then fleeing to the United States takes about 8 pages. And the same amount of space is given to him later on learning how to drive. And I was just so interested in the choice to balance those, big sweeping moments of story with the smaller, but still important everyday moments of story.
Yes, I think it's harder to write about the smaller things, right? You have to make it interesting, make it engaging, and ideally speaking, make it fresh. Also meaningful. That's harder to write. And so that's why, on the other hand, when you talk about, write about a flight escape from China, that it was in a way, it's a trope. So many people would linger on that. For me, I think that is not that hard to write about. It's really the smaller moments. I think that is more interesting.
I think that I definitely agree with that. What makes him particular as a character and not just any person who has left as an immigrant or exile is those domestic moments and how he is engaging with them, especially understanding that he was this huge celebrity who has now been reduced to almost anonymous in this new country. And I was really just interested in general at how you think about celebrity and also just thinking about how celebrity differs depending on, what country or what culture you're in. Because I was thinking a lot about how Tian is such a huge star. I was actually almost slow to understand how important he was, but almost in a country the size of 1 billion people, he's ubiquitous name. He is practically in the DNA of the Chinese people because of the songs that he sings and the popular movies that his voice is in. I was trying to think of a comparison, and it would be like if David Attenborough was mixed with the Beatles. Felt like how popular he was. And at the same time, his fame is very much connected to his government's decision to make him famous.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, among the Chinese artists, there's an unstated rule. You want to be famous, you want success, you want to become an artist, then there has to be a group. The party association really behind you. Otherwise, you can't do it by yourself. That's a common sense in China. And so that's why, in fact, my work is not welcome in China because I'm alone, and in a way I'm independent. So that is, the existence of such a writer or artist basically is against the mentality, the psychology designed by the Chinese government. So, and in his case, but on the other hand, I did have some real people in my mind, and not exactly the same figure, but as reference. I knew, for instance, there is a megastar, a singer, Guan Guimin. He used to be extremely famous in China, but he left, he started from scratch. He and his wife worked together as custodian and for some years, and they did all kind of manual work. But he's still performing. Nowadays, he's still performing. And so there are other artists like that. And so in a way, there are different senses of success. I think in this case, freedom is a big deal for an artist. You need the basic free spirit.
Yeah, absolutely. And the way that he expands as an artist, in part because of the hardship that he goes through, is something that you evoke very well.
Yes, and his perception of the world is different because of the hardship, and he would go pursue different kind of arts, and eventually he's more adaptable. When physically he couldn't sing, he began to write. So that is, in a way, the spirit, the fire is still there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a sense that the Tian from the very beginning, if he were to lose his voice, would be shattered, would have nothing.
Yes. Yes.
That's all he is.
Mm-hmm.
And through the process of surviving all the obstacles and adapting through it, by the end, when that voice is taken from him, he realizes that he still is a person, has a soul, has a spirit, and that he's always perhaps had that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he's still an artist.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what he wants to be. And so in that sense, of course, there is a cost. You cost, your starhood and all kind of a celebrity, but that's the price. If you want to live as a free person, a free artist, there's a heavy price for that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think that, it's the life that he would have had if he'd stayed back in Beijing with his family and his celebrity is evoked fairly, throughout the novel, especially during times of great challenge in America. And it almost seemed like a sliding door situation where, I would just start to imagine what his life would have been like if he had stayed behind. And I wondered if, because it's this necessary missing half to the novel, what could have been. Did you ever, just as a writing exercise, write the Tian that he would have been if he had stayed behind, just that side of his life?
I know I didn't write, but I could see there are a lot of I use the word general artists. The artists who became generals. They were not officers, but they are just civilian generals. In fact, there was a man who just died, an old man, and he was a songwriter. And he wrote a few, 3 or 4 popular songs for the party, for the army. Mm-hmm. He was a 3-star general in China. That was a joke, but that was true. There were a lot of people, lot of star generals in China. For instance, Xi Jinping's wife, she's a star general. She's really, just in terms of rank, she's a general, but she's a singer. So Tian could easily become one of those.
Absolutely.
But it's different. But doesn't mean you still, as an artist, you are better. Your art has developed. It didn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there is, he often is able to come back to just how much he's grown as an artist, as a way to, salve the worries of having left so much behind. And one of the areas that was especially emotional when thinking about what he's lost is the long distance family and relationship that he has to have when he's separated from his wife and daughter, and also his mother and his sister. And I think that is a very common story, so much so that, I think at one point, my mother was like, Chinese people are just built for long distance.
In a way, that's true, yes. And in a way, in fact, Yabing, he was perceptive about this. He said, as if all the rules, the codes, already coded into our DNA, you can endure more suffering and the painless bitterness is part of your life. Mm-hmm. And so nobody would question the powers why you take away my passport. Nobody would question. Mm-hmm. So that's but gradually, I think these immigrants, they realize they can live differently. Even the woman, plain woman, Funi, she realized life is different. With the freedom, it's different. Mm-hmm. Nobody can boss you. Nobody can really lord over you. Mm-hmm. That's a big difference. Right. If you are the same person as others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that I love that passage that you brought up with Yabin, thinking about the rules that he and Tian were just born into, which I took to mean also just cultural values,
Yes.
societal values. And in a book that is so interested in freedom, I was interested in seeing how maybe the most difficult freedom to gain is the freedom from those cultural values because they're so encoded in your way of life.
Yes. And that's why for a lot of people, freedom basically is an alien feeling, even alien idea. It can be very scary. And they would prefer security, certainty, to freedom. Freedom being also means you have to take care of yourself. Nobody would pay attention to you. And so that's very, very frightening. It will take a long time for people from different lands, cultures, to get used to it. A lot of people still couldn't. So that's why I said some famous artists eventually return.
Right.
Basically, the idea of freedom was too much.
Absolutely. There's the saying that people work better under limitations.
Yes, yes, that's true. Very Chinese, yes.
There's the sense that with freedom, with no limitations, you could do anything. You just are frozen solid because what can you do if you can do anything?
Yes, you are lost. You get cold feet. Sure, yes, that's very, very common. Very common.
And it's so interesting to think about how I think status and materialism are two kind of like false gods that are evoked throughout this novel. And beginning with Yabin thinking about how Chinese immigrants are too materialistic, too interested in the gaining of money. And whereas the people back home, like Tian's wife, is very focused on status and how one looks and what one can achieve. And it's interesting to think about how Tian has to resist both of those devils on his shoulders, because in the process of true freedom, it isn't actually substituting status with money. It's not substituting one restriction for another. And it's interesting to think that the way that maybe some immigrants end up becoming more interested in money initially to survive, but then as a way to orient their life, as a way to measure their own success, is an easy pitfall for Tian go into. And I was wondering how you were able to keep him truly free. How did you end up writing a character who was as free as he was?
He also, because he has to make money. His career performances also is kind of business. So that part is unavoidable. He was worried about where his next check would come from. That's normal. That's what it's an alien feeling to him. And also even Chinese officials understand that. Right? You see, now you live from hand to mouth. But in most places, artists are like that. That's the way you exist. And so for a lot of immigrants, there's a tradition, immigrants save a lot of money. They don't spend, they save, because cash becomes the only resort they have, the last resort they have. They can depend on it. But at some point, you can't go too far. The truth is, no matter, I think Funy said that, she used to deliver food in Weston and Lincoln, very wealthy towns. She realized no matter how hard she worked, she could never be that rich. So to get rich was no longer a purpose of her life. So that's very basic sense, common sense. And there is a certain point that you can never cross. And so material comfort can be provided if you work hard. But you can't say I will get rich, super rich, and that means you succeed. That would be silly. I think can understand that. In fact, Yading's life in a way illustrates that, right? He got wealthy and he was not happy at all.
Yeah, more money, more problems, exactly.
Yes.
And I think it's so interesting to think about not just Tian as a free person, but Funi as well, his female roommate, because Tian is an artist. And so this question of freedom, and he's a very successful artist. He's, has this one of a kind voice and this ability to touch people. Mm-hmm. And so in some ways, his path to freedom is, maybe only evocative of a certain kind of experience, one that you can only have if you have an artistic vocation, if you have a reason to sacrifice everything for artistic integrity. But Funi is just a normal person, not from any particularly, good background, or it doesn't have, money to go back to, family to go back to. And her journey to find freedom is also so interesting because you see her start to question, what do I have to do in order to have a family? What even is a family? In her, mind, if she had stayed behind, she would be, married and have children that way. But you see her exploring how to find love and a family and to build it herself without having to ascribe to maybe what would have been expected back in China. And I think that's so interesting to have the two of them both attempting to be free with totally different backgrounds and life stories.
Yes. But on the other hand, they started at the same the same line in a way, right? Immigrants. So of course, the starting point may be different. But in Funi's case, she has her own appreciation for the life here. Now, back in China, she understands at most she would become a factory worker. Mm-hmm. And in other words, her prospects would be very limited too. So she prefer here to just work to earn her own keep as a kind of free person. So her understanding, her perception of the world is very limited, but it's well-grounded.
Mm-hmm. It is. And I think, just kind of speaking back to the cultural codes of sacrifice and hard work that seem built into the DNA of a Chinese person, it does seem that the path to freedom is not for the faint-hearted. And it's interesting to think that the very codes of sacrifice and hard work that make a Chinese person more pliant to a government are also the same strengths that allow them to find freedom if they choose to look for it.
You're right, absolutely. Really, you have to be very strong-hearted to really continue. As I said, there are people who even became successful in the States who eventually returned to China. And basically, they got stuck. And you can see clearly the career really didn't develop anymore.
Mm-hmm. Right, absolutely. And, you can only imagine the whether that trickles down to their personal development as well.
Yes.
Absolutely. And I'm just keeping an eye on the clock. I have so many more questions to ask you, but I do want to make sure that other people have the chance. So I'll just throw it back to John to see if there's any questions from the audience.
We do have some questions from our audience so far. Jenny Lu writes in, I wonder, are your books available in China? If so, how are they received? Also, same question to Lillian.
Okay, Lily, has your book been translated into Chinese?
No.
Be very interesting, yes. On the other hand, you keep in mind they cut a lot. For instance, Walking Wang's novel in chemistry, in English is chemistry. We know that is nuanced, it has different meanings. But in China, they put it as China Girl. So that's really, it's a silly title, in fact. So my books, a third of my books were published in mainland China. But they cut a lot, and every book, no matter what, they always cut sentences. For instance, the collection of my stories, The Bridegroom, when I received the translation, there were 2 stories missing. So it happened like that, often like that. So now I don't care anymore because it's very hard to keep the integrity of the work.
That makes sense. Yeah. I mean, so much is already lost in translation. Yes. And then if there's someone purposefully trying to cut.
Yes. Even the biography of Li Bai I wrote, it was well received in China, very, very well received. But at the very start, they told me all references to contemporary China will be cut. So I know I had the feeling that the teeth of the book were pulled. So every time it gave me that kind of a negative anxiety.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense that your creative expression is not actually coming through in those instances.
Thank you. There's another question. Will you talk a bit about your writing process? So from a craft standpoint, how you go about from ideation to drafting to revision. And it's
sure.
possible. Take us through for the next 30 minutes. No, but just whatever you'd like to talk about.
Since I also teach and I had work, so I always urge my students to write the first draft quickly. So when you do you have your day job, you can spend time editing and revising every day. So I follow the same pattern, the same rule. Usually when in a winter break and especially summer break, I write a lot, very rough. Ideally speaking, if I could finish a draft of a book, it would be good, very quickly. And then during the semesters, I could work on it, revising and editing. So the real work basically is in revising and editing. And the first draft is basically, it's just like a big outline, but gradually I have to flesh out every part. How about you?
I have found that, and I've accepted that I will probably have to write over 800 pages to get 200 okay ones. There's a lot of sense of, in the same way that I think out loud, I think I have to think through my writing. So there's just a lot of dead ends that I'll go down. So for a while, the first draft can take, right now my first draft is taking like 2.5 to 3 years, but then the drafts after that point come through faster and faster. And I really enjoy the editing process.
I'm the opposite, because perhaps I started as a poet. So it's very hard for me to write the first draft, big first draft. Usually it's always editing, the revision. In that process, and the story gets bigger and bigger. So I'm just the opposite.
That makes sense then why you call your first draft an outline.
Yeah.
There's another question as well. If both of you could talk about some of your favorite novels or authors. So maybe I'll amend this to say sort of, if you would like to take it either direction, maybe sort of influences or touchstones or authors or texts you always go back to, or another direction might be, which is always curious to me as a bookseller, what contemporaries that you're enjoying or new works that you are excited about.
Okay, for me, because I also teach, so I like some old authors, and I used to read a lot of Naipaul, Where's Naipaul, especially the book Abandoned in the River. It is a great novel, so I still read it when I write. And in terms of influence, I read a lot of Russian literature. Especially Tolstoy and Chekhov. And contemporary authors, I read a lot. For instance, I had to follow my students and have the sense that what they have been reading. And I just finished Lily's book, really love it. I enjoy it a lot. And there is another older contemporary author, Grace Paley. I love her stories, full of humor, a different kind of humor, Gogolian in a way. And there was a Canadian author, I think she also passed, Carrie Shield. I think she's a great writer. And in other words, among the young writers, it's hard to tell about who reached that level. Those really basically, some of them already immortal, those great authors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that teaching recently has also shaped what I've been reading. I just taught a class about the set piece in novels, so like a self-contained scene, which is really interesting to think about. And I ended up spending a lot of time with Commonwealth by Patchett, which the first time I read, I don't think I fully appreciated just how self-contained all of her chapters were. All of them could be their own short stories, but it is this larger story about a family. So I was really interested in looking at that. And I also recently read, I don't read a ton of nonfiction, but this really caught my eye and had something to do with what I've been currently writing. And that's John Ronson's So You've Been Publicly Shamed. And it has some, similarities to themes that you cover in A Song Everlasting, because it's about people who have been completely shamed on social media because of a tweet that they wrote or a Facebook photo that they posted, and they became infamous and notorious as Twitter and other social media platforms just tore them apart. They were fired, they were ostracized by their communities, and it's interesting to see how social media also works in against Tian in your book. But I was really interested because the journalist tracks down all of the people who have been shamed on social media and talks to them about that experience. So I found that really interesting.
In fact, nonfiction are important, especially when you write about a novel you are not familiar with the topic.
Yeah.
So it's better to read nonfiction, really. I did read some biographies or memoirs of singers for this book.
Okay.
Like Renee Fleming, The Inner Voice, and a few others. Really, I realized how hard for a lot of singers, very successful American singers. And I remember there's in one book, she was so famous, but still, after a trip to Las Vegas, after all the performance and paying all the agents, the managers, and everything, she had like $6 or $7.
Wow. Yeah. I wondered did you read books about house renovation as well? Because that was one of my favorite parts to this book, is when he becomes a house renovator.
No, I haven't. No. But that part I happen to know a few local immigrant handyman, repairman. So that's why I knew some details about their business.
I was hoping that you went and actually built some houses yourself. I wanted to picture you making those window screens.
No.
We've got time for, I think, one more question. It's a question for you, Lillian. What are you working on at present? And please don't say you can't talk about it. Those are my words. Those are the viewers.
I can talk about it because I think further along now, but I'm still at the point of not quite knowing how to describe it, but it's basically about a childhood group of friends who graduate into the recession of 2008, and they're all from this highly competitive, highly status-oriented neighborhood in Maryland that's also Chinese American. And so this group of overachievers essentially has to move back home with their parents and is unable to find employment. And so at this state of, in some ways, being ostracized by their community or seen as cautionary tales, they end up agreeing to be a part of a documentary by another overachiever from their youth whose mother has been caught up in the housing crisis. So they do it as a favor to her, and out of a kind of touch of Schadenfreude as well. And the results of this documentary end up being the rest of the novel, and it kind of spans about 10 years, so right before the pandemic.
It sounds like you know how to talk about it.
I talk about all the events that lead up to the actual book. I have to figure out how to talk about the actual book.
Well, I'm hooked. You sold me. So, yeah. Well, Jin Lillian Li, thank you so much for joining us at Home with Literati. It's such a pleasure to have you both in conversation, and thank you so much for joining us. And of course, you can purchase A Song Everlasting in our physical store or online. There are links in the chat. And if you're watching us later on YouTube, there are always links to purchase books right in the description below me. But thank you both so much. And to all of our viewers, thank you for joining us as well. We look forward to seeing you at the next event.
Thank you so much, John. Thank
you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Lillian. Good luck with your new book.
Thank you. I'll need it. Bye.
Have a great night, all.
You too. Bye.